In western New York, where the Niagara River meets Lake Ontario, sits a strategic piece of land. Here, almost 3 centuries ago, a fortress was built. It would become center stage in the struggle for North America.
The French fought over this land, the natives fought over this land, and the British fought over this land, all because of a very unique geographic reality that Fort Niagara held for a long, long period of time.
The very ground is hallowed. You're standing on the soil where it happened.
Well before the American Revolution and through 2 world wars, this fort has stood while others have crumbled.
This isn't a movie. It's not a made-up facade. This is real history.
Funding for Fort Niagara, The Struggle for a Continent, was made possible through the generous support of M&T Bank. M&T Bank, understanding what's important.
To North America's colonial settlers, Niagara was a distant frontier. To the native people, the river at the western end of Lake Ontario marked passage around the Great Falls. For the French who followed, it was a portal into the heart of the New World.
In the 17th century, before there were artificial means of transportation, even roads, and barely trails, the easiest way to get around was by the water. And so if you controlled an important point on a water route, you could, in effect, control this whole water highway.
To control the region's lucrative trade in animal furs, the French occupy the mouth of the Niagara River. This sets them in commercial conflict with their European rival, England. To gain the advantage, both nations compete for the friendship of America's greatest empire, the Iroquois Confederacy.
On the battlefield, it was really hard to fight wars without Indian allies. They had all the survival skills you needed to be great guerrilla fighters, and all of that came to bear such that the British and the French were afraid of them.
In the early 1720s, the French asked local Iroquois for permission to build a house of peace at the river mouth.
It's a PR move. The House of Peace sounds much nicer than a fort to protect ourselves and gain a footage on this portage.
In 1727, French builders complete the 3-story stone house. It's a fortified outpost designed to garrison about 40 soldiers and withstand attack by anything short of artillery.
When they are finished, of course, they have staged an incredible coup on the British, and the British are howling in protest that they have established this very formidable house here at a very critical juncture in the transportation and supply routes.
In time, tensions between the empires would erupt into all-out war, and the House of Peace would be at the center of an epic battle. The Great War for Empire, also known as the French and Indian War, began in the wilds of the New World and spread like wildfire throughout the colonies.
This is going to be the last and the greatest of the colonial wars, and will really determine the fate of North American history much more than anything that comes after it.
If they are to rule the continent, the British know they must capture the French fort at Niagara.
In the 1750s, the French are certain that the British will be coming. It's just a matter of when.
To prepare for the inevitable assault, the French spend 3 years strengthening the fort. Finally, in the spring of 1759, thousands of British soldiers march into the New York frontier. Ahead of the troops at Oswego, a British Indian agent named William Johnson convinces nearly 1,000 Iroquois warriors to join the fight. On July 6th, some French soldiers hunt in the woods outside Fort Niagara. Their foray is interrupted by Iroquois warriors. They are the lead element of the British Army.
When the French are finally prepared for this British attack, they've got a fairly respectable garrison. They've got about 600 men.
The British number more than 3,000, yet they're alarmed at what they see. The French commandant, Pierre Pouchot, has created a ring of ditches and earthen walls to protect the fort from cannon fire and attacking infantry. A large powder magazine, with walls 4 feet thick, shelters their ammunition.
This is not some tiny little log stockade that is going to just crumble to their artillery. This is a major, major fortification.
Before fighting begins, the British offer the French one last chance to avoid bloodshed. An officer named Rutherford is sent to the French fort to request that Pouchot surrender.
As expected, Pouchot declined, saying in effect that he was expected to render honor to his king and his country, and he was not going to surrender his fortress easily. Well, the business was over at that point, and he could just as easily have sent him back to his lines, but the 18th century was in some ways perhaps a politer time, so he invited Rutherford to breakfast.
Soon, the battle for Fort Niagara would begin in deadly earnest.
Here you have this fortification out in the middle of nowhere, out in the wilderness, and it is fortified very much along European lines. And the battle that takes place here in July of 1759 is going to take place right out of a European siege manual. The British idea is going to be to get your cannons closer and closer to the walls of the fort so that you can do more and more damage.
This was done by digging a trench, by literally digging their way toward the fort. And they would dig in a zigzag fashion so that cannon fire from the fort couldn't go straight down their trench. You didn't want to point your trench right at the fort. That was turn it into a death trap.
Each night, the British advance their trench toward the fort. It's laborious, hazardous work. The woods outside the fort were crawling with British soldiers and their Iroquois allies.
As soon as Pouchot realizes that he is in fact up against a major force, he sends word to the French posts in the Ohio Valley and to the west to fall back onto Fort Niagara because, of course, if Niagara falls, all of those posts will fall in turn.
If the fort could hold out long enough, the French might have a chance to break the siege. After 2 weeks of fighting, the defenders are exhausted. On both sides, ammunition is almost gone. On July 20th, British trench diggers closed to within 100 yards of the fort. That night would bring them harsh setbacks. Their second in command is shot dead. An hour later, they would lose their leader, Brigadier John Prideaux.
It's not exactly clear what happened other than the fact that he stepped in front of a mortar.
The question, of course, comes up, who now is going to take command? And out in the middle of a wilderness, 2/3 of a way through a siege is not the time that you want to be making this sort of decision. What actually happens is William Johnson, the Indian agent, who really doesn't have any military rank, basically politics himself into a command position.
Johnson presses on with the siege. British artillery concentrates their fire on the lakeside of the fort, and the French walls begin to crumble.
Pouchot still has another ace up his sleeve, and this is these bands of French military troops and militia and so forth that are out in these western posts. If they can make it to Fort Niagara and if they can break through the British siege lines, then maybe, just maybe, they can either hold out a little bit longer or effectively disrupt the siege work and lift the siege.
Finally, on July 23rd, a Native American brings word to the fort that help is on the way.
This same Native American courier had stopped in the British camp, and he shared the same information with the British. So everybody knew this relief force was coming down the river road.
Wasting little time, the British take up defensive positions 1 mile south of the fort at a place called La Belle Famille. On the morning of July 24th, some 500 British and irregular soldiers wait for a French relief force of over 1,000 men.
They waited until the French were within about 30 yards, 90 feet.
Within 30 minutes, the French attack has collapsed.
It's a very brief, very bloody affair, and it is absolutely the last nail in Pouchot's coffin in terms of defending the fort.
Pouchot decides to give up the fort and ask the British for terms of surrender.
The entire length of the Fort Niagara siege covered about 19 days. That's a very respectable length of time for a fort like Niagara to hold out against a besieging army. In fact, it's one of the longer sieges in the history of North America.
The British capture of Fort Niagara severs the French lifeline to the west. In North America, the Great War for Empire is all but over. The Union Jack would fly over Fort Niagara for the next 4 decades. British occupation transforms the fort. For the rest of the 18th century, British forces centered at Niagara control access to the Great Lakes. With forts running from Nova Scotia to northern Michigan, they exert their dominance over the region.
The minute that the British expelled the French, their attitude toward the Indians, who they had previously needed as allies to fight the French, turned very, very arrogant. The Western Indians saw the British as a big threat. They knew that when the British came, they brought settlers. They knew the settlers took over land.
In 1763, the Indians rebel. They attack and capture virtually every British outpost on the Great Lakes. Only Forts Detroit and Niagara survive.
It very quickly is a lesson learned for the British. One of the other problems that they have now is a change in enemies. The French are gone from Canada and from the northern part of North America at least, and now Fort Niagara is going to be facing once again more a native threat than a European threat. And so they have to reevaluate the design of the fort and the defenses of the fort.
At 2 corners of the fort, the British build stone towers called redoubts. These small 3-story buildings were forts within a fort.
These are very effective strongholds. They're designed to hold about 25 men, and there are cannon platforms up on the 3rd floor.
One of the British officers involved in the construction of these buildings said that no force of Native Americans would ever pass between the fire of these 2 buildings in an attempt to attack Fort Niagara.
In the spring of 1775, a new rebellion is brewing. Colonists on the eastern seaboard are challenging British rule. During the 8-year War for American independence, Fort Niagara became a sanctuary for those who opposed the Revolution.
During the Revolutionary period, you see a lot of these loyalists fleeing to Fort Niagara for British protection. Many of these individuals are formed into military units of sorts, irregular military units to be sure, but very, very effective ones.
Beginning in 1778, John Butler, a New York farmer, and Joseph Brant, a Mohawk chief, lead raids against American settlements.
During the American Revolution, the Iroquois were very successful by sending small groups into agriculturally productive areas. And New York was the breadbasket, really, of the colonies. And the Indians had a big impact on shutting down farming.
In 1779, the Continental Army would retaliate against the raiders. American forces led by Generals John Sullivan and James Clinton march into Iroquois territory.
The Continental Force cut a swath through this area, destroying houses, destroying food supplies, doing everything that was possible to drive the Iroquois out of the war.
So it was mostly a cabin-burning, corn-chopping campaign. The soldiers spent more time killing corn than they did Indians.
However, with winter approaching and low on supplies, the Continental Army would not seriously threaten Fort Niagara.
From a military perspective, the raid is not terribly successful. It certainly does not put the Iroquois out of the war, although it does create a period of very bitter hardship for both the Iroquois and their British allies.
During the long, cold winter of 1779 and 80, hundreds of Iroquois, forced to take refuge at the fort, would starve. Though the Loyalist raiders would battle back, the American revolutionaries win the war. Even in victory, the new United States is in no position to force the British off the Great Lakes. It would take 11 years to resolve land claims and treaty disputes before Fort Niagara is finally handed over to the Americans.
When the British finally turn Fort Niagara over to the Americans in 1796, they're very quick to skirt right across the river and build a fort of their own.
Fort George stood only 3/4 of a mile away, across the new border in Canada.
Fort Niagara was never designed to be a border fortification. Its defenses, first of all, are facing the wrong direction. For the first time, the enemy is on the western side of the river, and all of these massive earthworks and all of the things that make Fort Niagara such a formidable obstacle are now just negated in one fell swoop.
In addition, Fort George's cannon batteries stand 9 feet higher.
With that 9 feet height differential, the guns of Fort George are able to command the parade ground at Fort Niagara. They're able to fire down into the fort itself.
Over time, the hostility of the American Revolution softens, and relations between the two sides become surprisingly cordial.
The British officers at Fort George, seeking any genteel society, befriended the American officers at Fort Niagara, and they would get together for shooting expeditions and have dinner together on one side or the other and that sort of thing.
But as a new century progressed, tensions between the nations would escalate and threaten the peace at Niagara. In June of 1812, the U.S. Congress, angered over violations of national sovereignty, declares war on Britain. When the news reaches the Niagara frontier, neither the Americans nor the British are prepared.
When word of the declaration of war arrived, there were several American officers from Fort Niagara who were having dinner with their British opposite numbers in the mess at Fort George.
You can imagine everyone jumping up and wine bottles knocked over as the Americans are perhaps more than a little concerned that they're on enemy territory. But according to the story, the officer in charge of the mess says, "Gentlemen, please be seated. Let's not let bad news ruin a good dinner."
They finished the meal in apparently cordial circumstances, and the U.S. officers were then allowed to return to Fort Niagara.
In October, cordial relations turned to conflict. In support of a land invasion by American troops, Niagara's batteries fire on Fort George. The British return fire, and with their height advantage, pulverize Fort Niagara. The costly lesson forces the Americans to make changes.
They do a number of things, not the least of which is to remove the roof from the stone house, the French castle, and turn the top floor into an elevated gun deck.
The alterations came just in time. On November 21st, Fort George's cannons again fire on Fort Niagara. The Americans return fire with heated cannonballs, hoping to start fires at Fort George.
Well, one of the most interesting things to come out of the November 1812 bombardment between Fort Niagara and Fort George is a character named Betsy Doyle. And what Betsy seems to have been doing is running the red-hot cannonballs, running the hot shot from the shot furnace, which had been erected on the roof of the castle, to the cannons back and forth, and evidently kept this up throughout the entire bombardment.
In his report after the battle, Lieutenant Colonel McFeely mentioned that she showed a fortitude equal to the Maid of Orleans, who, of course, was Joan of Arc.
Finally, in the spring of 1813, Fort Niagara's cannons, and the guns of an American naval squadron all but destroy Fort George.
While the campaign starts out very optimistically for the American Army with the capture of Fort George in May of 1813, things tend to turn sour after that.
By December 10th, the regular American forces have pulled out, and Fort George is left in the hands of restless militiamen ready to do the same.
The Americans decided to abandon the Canadian side, retreat back to the eastern shore, and in doing so burned not only the remnants of Fort George, but the entire town of Newark.
In retaliation, 562 British soldiers launch a daring nighttime assault on Fort Niagara. Using their bayonets, the British force their way inside. On this night, the American garrison is completely caught off guard.
Fort Niagara had a plan for defense against a British assault, and there were positions assigned to the various troops within the fort. But for some reason on that night, vigilance had been relaxed to the point of probably being criminal.
3 columns of British soldiers methodically attack each of the American strongholds. Small groups of defenders put up stiff resistance. But in less than 30 minutes, it was all over. 340 American soldiers became prisoners of war. 65 lay dead.
The British had achieved a major military victory and a trove of equipment and large numbers of cannon, muskets, gunpowder, all sorts of military stores. They captured the big American flag that flew over the garrison. They took the flag as a trophy of war.
On the morning of December 19th, 1813, the Union Jack was flying at Fort Niagara once again. The Treaty of Ghent ends the War of 1812, and Fort Niagara is returned to the Americans. The fort has seen its last shots fired in anger.
The opening of the Erie Canal in 1825 and the Welland Canal shortly thereafter, in one single blow, eliminate 150 years of geographic and military significance for Fort Niagara.
Minor border crises would spur further changes to the fort. But these improvements would soon be obsolete.
Following the Civil War, you get a real change in focus of the garrisons here. No longer is the walled fortification going to be an effective deterrent to modern artillery that can tear masonry fortifications apart. And so what you get instead is more of an emphasis on training. Fort Niagara reinvents itself.
Outside the fort's walls, American troops train for remote wars in Cuba, the Philippines, and Europe. But after World War I, the old fort is abandoned. Nearly 3 centuries of history is in danger of disappearing.
There were serious problems. The French castle was starting to collapse. There was always the relentless pounding of Lake Ontario against the point and the seawall that protected the fort.
Beginning in the mid-1920s, a number of people start to take a very keen interest in seeing that these buildings don't disappear.
Today, on behalf of New York State, the Old Fort Niagara Association is charged with preserving the site's past and its future. One of its most prized artifacts is the garrison flag, captured by the British in the War of 1812.
It was probably the flag that flew over Fort Niagara during the time that Betsy Doyle manned her cannon and that Fort Niagara, troops from Fort Niagara captured Fort George and right through the War of 1812.
Well, the Fort Niagara garrison flag is currently considered to be one of the most significant flags in America. Fort Niagara's flag bears a striking resemblance to the Star-Spangled Banner.
This grand but delicate artifact reclaims its rightful place back home at Fort Niagara. It began as an outpost and grew into a fortress. Through the eras, it's withstood the ravages of war and nature. On these grounds is written the struggle for a continent.
And you walk across the parade ground of Fort Niagara, and you know that on the night of December 19th, 1813, there were soldiers running across there with bayonets being fired on, firing at people, dying. Cannonballs flew over the walls in 1759, and you're in a place where real things happen. And I think that provides a real connection with the past.
This program was produced by WNED, which is solely responsible for its content. Funding for Fort Niagara, The Struggle for a Continent, was made possible through the generous support of M&T Bank. M&T Bank, understanding what's important.